Most women fight for half. Some fight for the house, the cars, or the alimony. But when Isabella signed the divorce papers, she asked for absolutely nothing. No money, no assets, no fight. Her husband, Richard, laughed as the door clicked shut, thinking he had pulled off the heist of the century. He thought he had discarded a boring housewife. He had no idea that he had just declared war on the secret owner of his entire world. 6 months later, a private jet touched down at his company gala, and Richard was about to learn a brutal lesson. The most expensive things in life are the ones you think you got for free. The sound of the Mont Blanc pen scratching against the heavy bond paper was louder than Richard expected. It was a dry, final sound, like a dead leaf being crushed under a boot. Richard Sterling sat behind his mahogany desk, a desk that cost more than most people's cars, and watched his wife, Isabella, with a mixture of impatience and concealed glee. He checked his Patek Philippe watch. He had a reservation at Le Coucou in 45 minutes, and Camilla hated waiting. "You understand what you're signing, Isabella?" Richard asked, his voice smooth, practiced, the same tone he used when calming nervous shareholders. "This is a complete waiver of spousal support. You get the small apartment in Brooklyn. I keep the Westchester estate, the loft in Tribeca, the portfolio, and full uncontested ownership of Sterling Robotics. No alimony, no retroactive claims." Isabella didn't look up. Her hair, usually pulled back in a severe, sensible bun that Richard found increasingly dowdy, fell slightly over her face. She looked tired, defeated, just as he had planned. "I understand, Richard," she said softly. Her voice was steady, lacking the hysteria he had prepped his lawyer, Arthur, to handle. Arthur, sitting in the corner armchair, shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Sterling, as a legal professional, I must advise you again to seek independent counsel. This settlement is highly unusual. You are walking away from a fortune estimated at—" "I don't need the numbers, Arthur," Isabella interrupted, finally raising her eyes. They were grey, unassuming eyes. Eyes that Richard had stopped looking into years ago, preferring to look past them. "I just want it to be over. I want a clean break. Richard wants his freedom, and I want mine." Richard leaned forward, flashing his winning smile, the one that had landed him on the cover of Forbes as the visionary of automation. "Bella, be reasonable," Richard said, feigning concern. "I'm not a monster. I'll write you a check for $50,000 to get you settled. I don't want you starving in the streets." "No," Isabella said. She capped the pen and slid the document across the polished wood. "I don't want your money, Richard. I never did. Just sign it." Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second. A tiny alarm bell rang in the back of his mind. Why is this so easy? He had prepared for a bloodbath. He had hidden assets in offshore accounts in the Caymans. He had depreciated the company's value on paper for months. He was ready for war. But here she was, surrendering before the first shot was fired. "She's weak," he told himself. "She's always been weak. She's a librarian's daughter who got lucky marrying me, and now she's too proud to ask for a handout." Richard picked up the pen. He signed his name with a flourish. Richard Sterling. "Done," he said, exhaling a breath he didn't know he was holding. Isabella stood up. She smoothed her skirt. She looked around the office. The awards on the shelf, the architectural models of the new robotics plant, the oil painting of Richard that hung behind the desk. "Goodbye, Richard," she said. "Take the town car," Richard offered, already reaching for his phone to text Camilla. "It's done. Free man." "No, thank you," Isabella said. "I'll walk." "Senan." She turned and walked out of the heavy oak doors. She didn't slam them. She didn't cry. She just left. Richard looked at Arthur. "Can you believe that?" "Not a dime." Arthur frowned, gathering the papers. "It's the best deal I've ever seen, Richard. But it feels wrong. People don't just walk away from $50 million. Isabella isn't people," Richard laughed. standing up and buttoning his Brioni suit jacket. "She's a mouse, and the mouse just scurried back to its hole. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a celebration to attend." As Richard walked out of his office, he felt lighter than air. He had the company, he had the money, and soon he would have Camilla on his arm, a woman who actually looked the part of a CEO's wife. He didn't notice that Isabella had left her wedding ring on the corner of his desk, and he certainly didn't notice that the diamond in the center, a stone he had claimed was a flawless 2-carat, was actually a high-grade cubic zirconia. The real diamond, the one his grandmother had given him to give to her, was gone. Because Isabella knew something Richard didn't. She knew that the diamond was the only thing of value Richard actually owned free and clear. Everything else, the company, the houses, the lifestyle, was built on a foundation of sand. And she was the one who controlled the tide. 3 months had passed since the divorce was finalized. Richard Sterling was living the life he had always felt he deserved. The Sterling Dynamics annual gala was approaching, the gala of the century, the press was calling it, and Richard was the golden boy of the New York tech scene. He stood on the balcony of the Tribeca loft, a glass of 25-year-old scotch in hand. Camilla was inside, loudly directing the caterers for a pre-gala brunch. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than Isabella's entire wardrobe. "Richard, darling," Camilla shouted, "the florist says they can't get the white orchids for the gala centerpieces. They want to use lilies." "Lilies? Can you believe it? Lilies are for funerals." "Tell them to fly the orchids in from Holland if they have to," Richard yelled back, irritated. "I don't care about the cost." He took a sip of scotch and frowned. The taste was off. Actually, a lot of things had been off lately. It started with the little things. The household staff, who had been with them for years, all resigned within a week of Isabella leaving. They didn't ask for raises, they just left. Richard had to hire a staffing agency, and the new maid stole silver forks. Then there were the invitations. Richard was used to being invited to the intimate, high-power dinners at the Metropolitan Club or private weekends in the Hamptons. But for the last 2 months, the phone had been strangely silent. When he ran into George Halloway, a key banking contact at the club, George had looked at him with a strange mixture of pity and confusion, and quickly excused himself. But the biggest problem was at the company. Sterling Robotics was bleeding cash. "It doesn't make sense," Richard muttered to himself, looking out at the skyline. He went back inside, ignoring Camilla's rant about flowers, and retreated to his home office. He pulled up the spreadsheets. For 10 years, Sterling Robotics had operated with a massive, mysterious influx of operational capital that Richard had always attributed to angel investors, managed by a blind trust called Argos Capital. He had never met the people behind Argos. He just knew that whenever he had a cash flow problem, he would complain about it at dinner, and within 48 hours, Argos would inject liquidity or approve a low-interest loan. He assumed it was his genius attracting capital. But since the day Isabella signed the divorce papers, Argos Capital had gone dark. "Pick up, damn it," Richard hissed, dialing the number for the Argos liaison. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Richard slammed the phone down. "Fine, I don't need them. We're going public next year anyway." He opened his email. There was a message from his CFO, marked urgent. Subject: supply chain issue. The microprocessors. "Richard, we have a major problem. The exclusive supplier for the guidance chips, Vanguard Tech, has notified us that they are declining to renew our contract. They are citing a restructuring of priorities. Without those chips, the MK4 prototype is a paperweight. We can't demo it at the gala." Richard felt a cold sweat prickle his hairline. The MK4 was the centerpiece of the gala. It was the reason he had invited the entire Fortune 500. "Get me Vanguard on the phone!" he roared, storming out of the office. Camilla looked up from her magazine. "Richard, stop shouting. You're ruining the vibe." "Shut up, Camilla," Richard snapped. "The business is under attack." He spent the next week in a frenzy. Every time he tried to solve a problem, another one appeared. The lease on the warehouse in Queens. It turned out the building was owned by a shell company that decided to triple the rent. The patent for their joint mechanism. A legal firm sent a cease and desist claiming prior art. It felt coordinated. It felt like a siege. But Richard was a narcissist. He couldn't see the pattern. He only saw enemies trying to bring down a great man. "They're jealous," he told Arthur, his lawyer, over lunch. "They see me solo, unburdened by that dead weight of a wife, and they want to test me. Well, I'm going to show them. The gala will proceed. I'll announce the acquisition of the Casis rival firm. I'll bluff about the chips." "Richard," Arthur said cautiously, "acquiring Casis requires capital we don't have. You're leveraged to the hilt." "I have a meeting," Richard said, a glint in his eye, "with the Aetherios Group. They're a European conglomerate looking for a US foothold. I sent them a proposal. Their representative is flying in for the gala to sign the deal." "Aetherios?" Arthur frowned. "I've heard the name. Very private. Very old money. Are you sure they're interested?" "They replied to my email personally," Richard grinned. "Well, the director's assistant did. They're sending a senior partner. I'm going to roll out the red carpet. Once Aetherios signs a check for $200 million, all these little problems go away." Richard leaned back. "And the best part, I sent an invite to Isabella." Arthur choked on his water. "You did what?" "I invited her to the gala," Richard laughed cruelly. "I want her to see it. I want her to see Camilla in a custom Dior gown. I want her to see me shaking hands with the Europeans. I want her to see exactly what she walked away from. She's probably living in a shoebox, eating ramen." Richard imagined Isabella sitting in her dreary little apartment, regretting the day she crossed him. He was right about one thing. Isabella was looking at an invitation. But she wasn't in a shoebox in Brooklyn. She was sitting on the terrace of a villa in Lake Como, Italy. The morning sun was hitting the water, making it sparkle like diamonds. Real diamonds. Isabella held the heavy cardstock invitation in her hand. The annual Sterling Gala. "Are you going to go?" a voice asked from behind her. Isabella turned. A man in a linen suit stood there. This was Donovan, her true attorney, not the family lawyer Arthur, who was a fool, but the man who managed the real family trust, the trust that her grandfather, a steel magnate who hated publicity, had built, the trust that operated under the name Argos Capital and Vanguard Tech and the shell company that owned the Queen's warehouse. Isabella smiled. It wasn't the shy, submissive smile Richard knew. It was a smile that had teeth. "Oh, I'm going, Donovan," she said, taking a sip of espresso. "Richard wants a show. I think we should give him one." "The Gulf Stream is fueled and ready," Donovan said, "and the acquisition papers for Aetherios Group are finalized. You are officially listed as the majority stakeholder." Isabella stood up. "Excellent. Tell the pilot we fly to New York tonight. And Donovan?" "Yes, Bella?" "Call the fashion house in Milan. I need something to wear. Something that says, 'Hostile Takeover.'" The Sterling Dynamics Gala was held at the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan, a venue chosen specifically for its old-world opulence. Richard wanted the contrast. He wanted his sleek, terrifyingly advanced robots standing next to crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes. It was a metaphor, he told the press, for the marriage of tradition and future. But as Richard stood at the top of the grand staircase, greeting guests with a smile that was beginning to make his jaw ache, the only marriage he was thinking about was the one he had just ended. "Richard, stop checking your phone," Camilla hissed. She was clutching his arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong. She wore a dress made of silver scales that she claimed was avant-garde, but Richard secretly thought made her look like a high-end trout. "The Aetherios people will be here when they get here. You look desperate." "I am desperate, Camilla," Richard whispered back, leaning in so the photographer nearby wouldn't catch the movement. "If they don't sign the letter of intent tonight, the bank calls the loan on the Westchester house on Monday, and the payroll account for next month is currently empty. Camilla's smile didn't waver, but her eyes went cold. Well, fix it. I didn't divorce my oil tycoon husband to date a bankrupt mechanic. Richard flinched. That was the thing about Camilla. She was exciting, yes. She was beautiful, undeniably. But she was transactional. Isabella had been safe. Isabella would have been holding his hand, telling him they would figure it out, offering to sell her grandmother's jewelry. God, why am I thinking about her? Richard shook his head. She's probably sitting in her pajamas in Brooklyn right now, watching this on Instagram. The ballroom was filling up. The elite of New York were here, drinking Richard's champagne and eating his caviar. There were senators, tech rivals, and hedge fund managers, but the atmosphere was strange. There was a murmur running through the crowd. Richard spotted George Holloway, the banker who had shunned him at the club. George was whispering frantically to a man Richard recognized as the CEO of Orion Systems, Sterling's biggest competitor. Richard descended the stairs, pulling Camilla with him. "George, Grant, so glad you could make it." Both men stopped talking immediately. They looked at Richard with an expression that sat somewhere between amusement and pity. "Hello, Richard," Grant said, swirling his whiskey. "Bold move, holding the gala this year. Very bold." "Why wouldn't I?" Richard laughed too loudly. "Stock is up. Innovation is peaking." "Is it?" George asked, raising an eyebrow. "I heard a rumor that Vanguard pulled your chip supply." "Hard to build robots without brains, Richard." Richard froze. That information was top secret. Only he, his CFO, and the supplier knew. "Industry gossip." Richard waved a hand dismissively. "We have a new supplier, better tech. Actually, I'm about to announce a partnership with the Etherios Group. They're flying in tonight." Grant and George exchanged a look. "Etherios?" Grant asked. "The European Shadow Fund. They don't partner, Richard. They consume." "We'll see," Richard said stiffly. Suddenly the music changed. The string quartet stopped playing their polite Mozart, and a silence swept across the room, starting from the entrance and rolling towards the stage like a wave. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Richard turned towards the massive double doors. "Is that them?" Camilla asked, standing on her tiptoes. "Is that the Europeans?" The doors swung open, but it wasn't a group of stuffy European bankers in grey suits who walked in. It was a woman. She was flanked by 4 men who looked like they were carved out of granite. Private security, clearly, but dressed in tuxedos that cost more than Richard's car. The woman was wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet that hugged every curve, dropping off the shoulders to reveal skin that glowed under the chandeliers. Around her neck sat a necklace of sapphires and diamonds, so large, so heavy, that the light hitting them fractured into 1,000 blue sparks across the room. Her hair, no longer in the tight, severe bun Richard hated, cascaded in loose, glossy waves around her face. Her makeup was sharp, accentuating eyes that scanned the room with the precision of a predator. Richard squinted. The woman looked familiar. The walk, that confident, gliding stride, was foreign. But the face... "No," Richard breathed. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. It was Isabella. But it wasn't the Isabella he knew. It wasn't the woman who clipped coupons and worried about the electric bill. It wasn't the woman who wore cardigans and apologized for taking up space. This woman owned the space. "Who is that?" Camilla gasped, her jealousy flaring instantly. "And why is she wearing the Romanov sapphires? Those are museum pieces." The room erupted in whispers. "Is that the ex-wife? I thought she was left with nothing. Look at who she's walking with. Is that the director of the Swiss bank?" Isabella didn't stop at the entrance. She walked straight into the crowd. The sea of people parted for her. Men who had ignored Richard for months were suddenly bowing to her, reaching out to shake her hand. She greeted them by name, smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He watched as Grant, his rival, practically ran over to her. Isabella offered him her hand, and he kissed it. "Richard," Camilla shook him. "Do something. She's upstaging us at our own party." Richard shook off his shock. Anger took its place. How dare she? How dare she show up here looking like that, wearing jewelry she undoubtedly rented or stole, trying to humiliate him? She was probably here to beg. That was it. She had spent the $50,000 he offered, realized she was destitute, and put on a show to try and get a better settlement. "Stay here," Richard growled to Camilla. He marched across the room, his face red. He shoved past a waiter. "Isabella!" he barked when he was 10 feet away. The circle of admirers around her went quiet. Isabella turned slowly. She looked at him. Not up at him, not down at him. She looked through him. "Hello, Richard," she said. Her voice was different, deeper, resonant. It was the voice of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. "What are you doing here?" Richard demanded, oblivious to the 100 eyes watching them. "Security list is strictly VIP. I don't recall sending an invite to the public library." A few people gasped. Isabella smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm smile. "I received an invitation, Richard. In fact, I believe I'm the guest of honor." "Guest of honor?" Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "You're delusional. Look, Bella, if you needed money, you should have called my assistant. We could have arranged a monthly stipend. You didn't need to rent a dress and crash my gala to beg." The man standing next to Isabella stepped forward. He was tall, silver-haired, and radiated power. "Mr. Sterling," the man said with a thick Swiss accent, "I would advise you to speak to Madame Sterling with more respect." "Who the hell are you?" Richard snapped. "I am Heinrich von Braun," the man said smoothly, "director of the Aetherios Group." Richard froze. His brain tried to process the information. Aetherios, the investors, the saviors. "Mr. von Braun," Richard stammered, his anger instantly replaced by sycophancy. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry. I've been waiting for you, but why are you standing with my ex-wife?" Heinrich looked at Isabella. He bowed his head slightly. "I am standing with her," Heinrich said, "because she is the chairman of the board for Aetherios. She is my boss, and Mr. Sterling, she is the one reviewing your loan application." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum. Richard looked at Isabella. He looked at the sapphires. He looked at the way the most powerful banker in Europe bowed to her. "No," Richard whispered, "that's impossible. You're nobody." Isabella took a step forward. She was close enough that he could smell her perfume. It wasn't the vanilla scent she used to wear. It smelled like winter air and expensive lilies. "I was never nobody, Richard," she said softly, so only he could hear. "I was just quiet, and you were too loud to notice the difference." The gala continued, but the dynamic had shifted tectonically. Richard was no longer the host. He was the entertainment. The guests, sensing blood in the water, circled Isabella. Richard retreated to the bar, downing 2 scotches in rapid succession. Camilla was nowhere to be found. She had likely fled to the bathroom to call her lawyer or scrub her Instagram of photos with him. "This is a nightmare," Richard muttered. Arthur, his lawyer, appeared beside him. He looked pale and was sweating profusely. "Richard," Arthur hissed, "we have a problem. A big one." "You think?" Richard gestured wildly towards the center of the room where Isabella was holding court. "My ex-wife just showed up as the head of the firm I'm begging for money. How is that even possible? Her father was a librarian." "Her father was a librarian," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "Her mother was the only child of Elias Thorne." Richard blinked. "Thorne? Like Thorne Steel? Thorne Shipping?" "Yes," Arthur said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Apparently her mother was estranged from the family for marrying a commoner. But when the old man died 10 years ago, the trust skipped a generation. It went entirely to Isabella." Richard felt the room spin. 10 years ago. We were married then. Yes. That means. That money was marital property. Richard's eyes lit up. Arthur, that's it. She defrauded me. If she inherited billions while we were married and didn't disclose it, I can sue her. I can get half. I can get everything. Arthur shook his head grimly. I checked the prenup, Richard. The one you insisted on. The one where you wanted to protect your future millions from her. There's a clause. Assets acquired via inheritance or trust remain the sole property of the beneficiary. You wrote that in to protect your parents' house in the Hamptons. You played yourself. Richard gripped the bar. He felt sick. He had insisted on that clause. He remembered laughing about it, telling his friends he didn't want her getting her hands on his family's meager estate. Meanwhile, she was sitting on an empire. It doesn't matter, Richard said, trying to regain his composure. She's here to do business. Aetherios is a business. If the deal makes sense, she'll sign. She's too pragmatic to throw away a good investment just to spite me. He straightened his tie. I'm going to pitch her. I'm going to treat her like any other investor. Richard walked back into the fray. He found Isabella near the ice sculpture, talking to the Senator of New York. "Excuse me, Senator," Richard interrupted. "I need a moment with the chairman." The senator looked at Isabella. She nodded once, dismissing him. "Hello again, Richard," she said. "Cut the crap, Bella," Richard said, keeping his voice low. "So you're rich. Congratulations. You hid it well. But we're business people. You're here because Sterling Robotics is the future. You want in. I'm willing to let Aetherios buy a 20% stake, but the price has gone up." Isabella laughed. It was a genuine, amused sound that unnerved him more than her anger. "You think I'm here to invest?" she asked. "I know you are. You need my tech. The MK4 robot is revolutionary." "The MK4, Isabella mused. "Is that the one that relies on the gyroscope patent from Casis?" "Yes," Richard said, "which we licensed." "Actually," Isabella said, taking a sip of champagne, "you didn't. The license expired 3 months ago. You forgot to renew it because you were too busy hiding assets during the divorce. And guess who bought Casis last week?" Richard stopped breathing. "No." "Aetherios acquired Casis on Tuesday," Isabella said, "which means every MK4 unit you produce is currently infringing on my patent. I could shut down your production line with a single phone call. In fact, Donovan." The man in the linen suit who had been shadowing her stepped forward and handed her a phone. "Don't," Richard pleaded. "Bella, please. Think about the employees." "I am thinking about them," she said. "That's why I'm not shutting you down. Yet." "What do you want?" Richard asked. He felt small. He felt like a child. "I want a meeting," she said. "In the boardroom. Now. Bring your lawyer." She turned and walked towards the elevators. The crowd parted for her again. Richard followed, head down, like a prisoner walking to the gallows. As they entered the elevator, Camilla came running up. "Richard, where are you going?" "Not now, Camilla," Richard snapped. "He's going to discuss the terms of his surrender," Isabella said calmly to Camilla. Then she looked Camilla up and down. "Nice dress. Polyester blend?" The doors closed before Camilla could scream. The boardroom on the 40th floor was silent. The city lights of Manhattan sprawled out below them, a grid of electricity that Richard usually looked upon as his kingdom. Now it felt like the bars of a cell. Isabella sat at the head of the table, Richard's seat. Heinrich von Braun sat to her right. Donovan sat to her left. Richard and Arthur sat on the opposite side. "Let's make this simple," Isabella said. She didn't open a folder. She didn't need notes. "Sterling Robotics is insolvent." "That's a lie," Richard blustered. "We have cash flow issues, sure, but the valuation is based on projected earnings from the MK4, Heinrich interrupted, "which, as we established, is built on stolen IP. Your debts currently exceed your assets by $40 million. You're hemorrhaging cash, and your credit rating just dropped to junk status." "How do you know my credit rating?" Richard demanded. Because we are the ones who hold your debt, Donovan said. Richard looked at Arthur. Arthur looked like he was going to vomit. What? Richard asked. Argos Capital, Isabella said. Richard's head snapped up. Argos? The angel investors? The ones who saved me? Me, Isabella said. She tapped her chest lightly. I am Argos. For 10 years, Richard, I have been funneling money into this company. Every time you overspent, every time you made a reckless gamble, every time you bought a sports car on the company card, I covered it. Through Argos. Richard sat back, stunned. Why? If you had the money, why didn't you just tell me? Why let me stress? Because I wanted you to succeed, she said, a hint of sadness finally entering her voice. I loved you, Richard. I knew your ego couldn't handle being supported by your wife. You needed to be the self-made man. So I let you play the part. I stayed in the background. I lived in the small house. I let you think you were the genius. But then, her voice hardened. You started to believe your own press. You started to treat me like an accessory. You cheated. You lied. And when you served me the divorce papers, you laughed. Richard remembered the laugh. It echoed in his ears now. I cut the funding the day the divorce was final, Isabella said, and look how quickly your empire crumbled without me propping it up. 3 months, Richard. That's how long you lasted on your own. So what now? Richard whispered. You here to gloat? You want to see me beg? I don't want your begging, Isabella said. I want the company. She slid a single piece of paper across the table. This is a buyout offer. Richard grabbed the paper. He scanned the number. $1, Richard screamed. He stood up, knocking his chair over. $1. This company is worth billions. This company is worth negative 40 million, Isabella corrected. I am offering to assume the debt. I will pay off the creditors. I will keep the factories open. I will save the employees' jobs. But you walk away. I built this, Richard yelled. It's my name on the building. And it will stay your name, Isabella said, as a legacy brand. But you will be removed as CEO effective immediately. You will be stripped of your shares, and you will vacate the premises. I won't sign, Richard said. I'll fight you. I'll declare bankruptcy. If you declare bankruptcy, Arthur whispered, the forensic accountants will come in. They'll find the offshore accounts, Richard. They'll find the tax evasion. You'll go to prison. Richard looked at Arthur, betrayed. You're supposed to be on my side. I am advising you on how to stay out of jail, Arthur said. Take the deal. Richard looked at the paper. $1. He looked at Isabella. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked bored. She was checking her watch. You have 5 minutes, Isabella said. After that, I recall the loans. I enforce the patent infringement, and I release the dossier on your embezzlement to the SEC. You choose, a clean exit or a federal indictment. Richard looked out the window. The gala was still going on downstairs. They were toasting to his success. He realized, with a crushing weight, that he had never been successful. He had been a child playing with toys his wife bought him. He picked up the pen. It was the same Mont Blanc he had used to sign the divorce papers. He signed his name, Richard Sterling. Isabella reached into her purse. She pulled out a crisp, single $1 bill. She placed it on the table. Done, she said. She stood up. Heinrich and Donovan stood with her. What happens to me? Richard asked, his voice breaking. Where do I go? I hear the apartment in Brooklyn is available, Isabella said. I moved out this morning. She turned to leave. Wait, Richard said. The gala. I have to go down there. I have to give a speech. Isabella stopped at the door. She looked back over her shoulder, the sapphires catching the light. Oh, don't worry about the speech, Richard, she said. I'll give it. After all, it's my company now. The elevator ride down from the 40th floor felt like a descent into hell, but for Isabella, it was a victory lap. She watched the numbers tick down, 39, 38, 37, and with each passing floor, She felt the weight of 10 years of silence lifting off her shoulders. Beside her, Donovan adjusted his cufflinks. "The press release is already live," he said quietly. "Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times just broke the story. Aetherios Group acquires Sterling Robotics in hostile takeover. CEO Richard Sterling ousted. The stock price actually jumped 8% on the news." Isabella smiled, a cold, sharp expression. "The market hates uncertainty, Donovan, and Richard was nothing if not uncertain." When the elevator doors slid open on the ballroom level, the atmosphere had changed. The hushed whispers from before had turned into a frantic buzz. Every phone in the room had lit up with the news. As Isabella stepped out, the sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns didn't just part. They recoiled, creating a wide avenue of awe and fear. She walked towards the stage. She didn't look for Richard. She knew he was still up in the boardroom, staring at a $1 bill, trying to comprehend the demolition of his ego. Isabella took the microphone. The feedback whined for a split second before silence fell over the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Isabella began. Her voice was steady, magnified by the speakers, filling every corner of the room. "Thank you for your patience. I know many of you came here tonight, expecting a demonstration of the MK4 prototype. You came to see the future." She paused, letting the tension build. "The future is not a machine," she said. "The future is stability. Tonight, I am pleased to announce that Sterling Robotics has been fully acquired by the Aetherios Group. We are restructuring, we are refinancing, and we are removing the instability that has plagued this company for the last 3 quarters. A murmur went through the crowd. They knew what instability meant. It was code for Richard. "Effective immediately," Isabella continued, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Camilla, who was standing near the shrimp tower, looking frantically at her phone. "Mr. Richard Sterling has stepped down as CEO to pursue personal interests. I will be assuming the role of interim CEO until a suitable replacement is found. Please, enjoy the champagne. It's on me." The applause was polite at first, then thunderous. These people didn't care about Richard. They cared about their investments. They cared that the company was now backed by real European money, not Richard's smoke and mirrors. As the applause died down, the elevator doors opened again. Richard stumbled out. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wild. He saw Isabella on the stage, his stage, basking in the applause of his friends. He ran toward the stage. "Wait!" he shouted. "She tricked me! She's lying!" The room went deadly silent. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a car crash. Donovan stepped in front of the stage, crossing his arms. 2 large security guards, men Richard had hired, stepped up beside him. "Sir," one of the guards said, his voice flat, "you need to leave." "I'm the CEO!" Richard screamed, his face turning a mottled purple. "I pay your salary." "Actually, Mr. Sterling," the guard said, "Mrs. Isabella signs the checks now, and she has removed you from the access list." Richard looked around the room, desperate for an ally. He locked eyes with George Halloway. "George, tell them. We played golf last week." George Halloway looked at his shoes, suddenly finding the pattern of the carpet fascinating. Richard turned to Grant, his rival. "Grant, you know this is a hostile takeover. Help me." Grant just raised his glass of champagne in a mocking toast. "Business is business, Richard." Then Richard saw her. The last lifeline. "Camilla!" Richard cried out, rushing toward her. "Camilla, baby, we have to go. We'll call your father. We'll sue them. We'll take the jet to the Caymans." Camilla stood there, frozen. She was holding her phone, the screen displaying the breaking news article. Richard Sterling, the fraud behind the mask. She looked at Richard, sweaty, desperate, broke, and then she looked at Isabella on the stage, regal, powerful, billionaire. "Don't touch me," Camilla hissed, taking a step back. "What?" Richard stopped, stunned. "You told me you were worth 50 million, Camilla said, her voice rising so the people nearby could hear her perform her own outrage. "You told me you were a visionary. You're a fraud, Richard. You're broke." I can fix it," Richard stammered. "I still have the house in Westchester. We can sell it." "The house is mortgaged to the hilt," Camilla spat. "My lawyer just checked. You have nothing. You are nothing." She reached up and unclasped the diamond necklace he had given her for her birthday. She threw it at his chest. "It's probably fake anyway," she sneered. "Camilla, please." "Security!" Camilla shouted, pointing a manicured finger at Richard. "This man is harassing me." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for was now calling security on him at his own party. The guards moved in. They grabbed Richard by the arms. "Let me go!" Richard thrashed. "I am Richard Sterling. I am a genius." Isabella watched from the stage. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just watched with a detached curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. As they dragged him towards the exit, Richard looked back one last time. He caught Isabella's eye. She raised her hand in a small, polite wave. The same wave she used to give him when he left for work in the mornings, back when he ignored her. The doors slammed shut. The music started up again, a lively jazz number. The crowd went back to drinking, the memory of Richard Sterling already fading like a bad dream. Isabella walked down the stairs. Heinrich handed her a fresh glass of sparkling water. "That was brutal," Heinrich noted. "No," Isabella said, taking a sip. "That was just the balance sheet, correcting itself." 11 months later, the alarm clock didn't chime. It screamed. It was a jagged electronic pulse that cut through the stale air of the basement apartment in Queens. Richard Sterling groaned, his hand fumbling in the dark to silence the noise. His fingers brushed against a sticky patch on the nightstand, a spill from a cup of instant noodles he hadn't had the energy to clean up the night before. He rolled over, the thin springs of the mattress digging into his ribs. For a fleeting, cruel second, his brain forgot. He expected to wake up in the Tribeca loft, the smell of fresh espresso wafting from the kitchen, the 800 thread-count Egyptian cotton sheets cool against his skin. He expected to check his phone and see his stock portfolio up by 3%. Then he opened his eyes and saw the water stain on the ceiling. It was shaped like a skull. Reality crashed down on him like a physical blow. There was no loft. There was no portfolio. There was only the damp, grey morning of a man who had lost everything. Richard sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked older than his 42 years. The stress lines around his mouth were deep trenches now, and his hair, once fastidiously dyed and styled, was thinning and streaked with a dull, defeated grey. He shuffled to the kitchenette, a corner of the room with a hot plate and a mini-fridge that hummed aggressively. He made instant coffee, stirring the clumps of powder with a plastic spoon he had saved from a takeout order. He stood in front of the cracked mirror in the bathroom to shave. He looked at his eyes. They were the same eyes that had stared down board members and charmed investors. Now they just looked tired. "You're still a visionary," he whispered to the reflection. But his voice cracked. It was a lie he couldn't even sell to himself anymore. He pulled on his uniform. It was a bright blue synthetic polo shirt, the fabric scratchy and unbreathable. Embroidered on the chest was a logo, Swift Logistics. Underneath, in smaller text, a division of Etherios Group. That was the ultimate cruelty. He didn't just work in a warehouse. He worked in her warehouse. The commute was a 40-minute subway ride of humiliation. He kept his head down, terrified he might run into someone from his old life. A junior analyst, a former intern. Anyone who would recognize Richard Sterling, the robotics tycoon, standing in a crowded train car smelling of mothballs and despair. When he swiped his badge at the warehouse entrance, the terminal beeped a harsh red before turning green. "You're late, Rick," the floor manager barked. Jason was 23 years old, with a patchy beard and a clipboard he wielded like a scepter. In Richard's old life, Jason wouldn't have been qualified to park Richard's car. Now, Jason owned him. Subway was delayed, Richard muttered, heading for his station. Excuses don't increase throughput, Jason said, marking something on his clipboard. Get to Sector 4. One of the MK4 units is acting up. It's jamming the sorting line. Richard froze. The MK4. He walked to Sector 4, the vast, cavernous space filled with the hum of machinery. And there they were. Hundreds of them. The sleek, articulated robotic arms he had debuted in his mind 1,000 times. They were moving with blinding speed, sorting packages, scanning barcodes, pivoting with a grace that was almost biological. But Unit 7 Alpha was stalled. It was twitching, a red light pulsing on its chassis. Richard approached it. He popped the maintenance panel. He knew the wiring schematics by heart. He had drawn the original napkin sketches for this servo mechanism. He reached in to reset the actuator. "Careful, old man," a co-worker named Ramirez jeered from the next aisle. "Don't short it out. That machine costs more than your life." Richard grit his teeth. "The tension on the secondary belt is too high," he muttered to himself. "It's a design flaw in the calibration software." He grabbed a wrench. For a moment, he wasn't Rick the warehouse grunt. He was Richard Sterling, engineer. He adjusted the torque, bypassed the safety limiter, and rebooted the system. The robot hummed to life. The red light turned green. It resumed its work, faster and smoother than before. Richard stepped back, a flicker of pride igniting in his chest. "I still have it," he thought. "I'm still the genius." "Attention all staff," the intercom crackled, cutting through the noise. "Operations will be pausing for 15 minutes for a VIP site inspection. Please clear the aisles and stand by your stations." The warehouse fell silent. The hum of the belts died down. "Look sharp," Jason hissed, running down the line, tucking in his shirt. "Corporate is here. The chairwoman is here." Richard's blood ran cold. He couldn't be seen. Not here. Not like this. He looked for a place to hide, but they were already entering the sector. A phalanx of suits, security guards with earpieces. And in the center, walking with a stride that commanded the very air around her, was Isabella. She looked breathtaking. She wore a tailored white suit that seemed to repel the grime of the warehouse. Her hair was loose, bouncing slightly as she walked. She didn't look like the librarian's daughter anymore. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. To her right walked Heinrich von Braun. To her left was the warehouse director, a man Richard had once fired for incompetence, now sweating as he tried to impress Isabella. "Efficiency is up 14% this quarter," the director was saying. "The integration of the Aetherios AI into the Sterling hardware has corrected the legacy issues." "Legacy issues," Isabella repeated. Her voice carried clearly in the silence. "You mean the hardware defects left by the previous administration?" "Yes, Madame Chairwoman." Richard shrank behind a pallet of boxes. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Legacy issues. That was his legacy. A defect to be corrected. Isabella stopped. She was 10 feet away from where Richard was crouching. "This unit," Isabella said, pointing to the robot Richard had just fixed. "Unit 7 Alpha. It's running above spec. The movement is fluid." "Ah, yes," the director stammered, checking a tablet. "We must have updated the firmware." Isabella stepped closer to the machine. She looked at the maintenance panel. It was still slightly ajar. She looked at the grease smudge on the casing, a smudge left by Richard's thumb. She turned her head. Her eyes scanned the shadows of the aisle. For one terrifying electric moment, her gaze bored straight through the gap in the boxes where Richard was hiding. She saw him. Richard stopped breathing. He waited for the finger point. He waited for the laughter. He waited for her to drag him out and parade him in front of the staff as the fallen king. Isabella held his gaze for 3 seconds. Her expression was unreadable. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was a total, devastating indifference. She turned back to the director. "It seems someone made a manual adjustment," she said coolly. "It's clever, but unauthorized. Have the engineering team analyze it. If it works, implement it fleet-wide. If not, discard it." "And the employee responsible?" the director asked. Isabella paused. "Process the paperwork. We don't need unauthorized variables in my company." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a rhythm of finality on the concrete. 10 minutes later, Jason tapped Richard on the shoulder. He wasn't holding his clipboard. He was holding an envelope. "Pack your stuff, Rick," Jason said, his voice unusually quiet. "You're done." Richard didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He took the envelope. He walked out of the warehouse into the blinding afternoon sun of Queens. He sat on a curb near a rusted chain-link fence and opened the envelope. Inside there was a check. It was for $50,000. The exact amount he had offered Isabella to survive on the day of the divorce. The pity money. Behind the check was a note, handwritten on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with the embossed Etherios header. "Richard, I saw the adjustment you made to Unit 7 Alpha. It was brilliant. It was the kind of engineering that made me fall in love with you 20 years ago. But you didn't fix the machine because you wanted to make the company better. You fixed it because you wanted to prove you were still the smartest person in the room. You fixed it for your ego. That is why you will never build anything that lasts. You build for applause. I build for utility. I am terminating your employment, not out of malice, but out of mercy. A man like you will rot in a warehouse. You need to go somewhere where no one knows the name Sterling. Take the check. It is a severance package, tax-free. Go to Florida. Buy a small boat. Find a dive bar. Tell the strangers there that you used to be a king. They might even believe you. But do not try to return. You are a ghost here, Richard, and I have exorcised the building." Isabella Richard stared at the check. The paper trembled in his hand. $50,000. It was enough to start over. It was enough to disappear. He looked up at the warehouse. He saw the logo on the side of the building, the stylized A of Etherios, overshadowing the faded outline of where the Sterling Robotics sign used to be. He realized then that she hadn't just beaten him. She had erased him. She had taken his company, his money, his reputation, and even his ideas, and she had done it without raising her voice. Richard stood up. He crumpled the blue polo shirt and tossed it into a trash can. He put the check in his pocket. He walked towards the train station, but stopped at a newsstand. On the rack, the new issue of Time magazine was displayed. The cover was a striking black-and-white portrait of Isabella. She looked powerful, serene, and terrifyingly competent. The headline read, "The Silent Architect: How Isabella Thorne Saved the Future from Its Creator." Richard looked at the face of the woman he had lived with for a decade. He remembered asking her to fetch him coffee. He remembered talking over her at dinner parties. He remembered laughing when she signed the papers. He touched the magazine cover, his finger tracing her jawline. "I never knew you," he whispered. He turned his collar up against the cold wind and walked down the subway stairs, descending into the dark, just another anonymous face in a city that had forgotten his name. And just like that, Richard Sterling vanished. He learned the hardest lesson of all. The person you underestimate today might be the one signing your severance check tomorrow. Isabella didn't just win the divorce. She rewrote history. She proved that true power isn't about how loud you shout, but about what you can build in silence. Now I have to ask you guys, did Isabella go too far? Was firing him from the warehouse the ultimate act of cruelty? Or was it the mercy he needed to finally let go? I want to see your debates in the comments. If you think Richard got what he deserved, type Team Isabella. If you think she was too harsh, type Team Richard. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It helps us create more epic stories like this one. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Next week, we have a story about a billionaire who went undercover as a janitor in his own company and uncovered a conspiracy that will blow your mind. You do not want to miss it. Thanks for watching.